did that was because I want you guys, as you're taking our quizzes, to pay attention to what the question is actually asking. We are not trying to trick you. If we're asking about height and elongation, that's what we're asking about. Don't overthink it. Same situation here. In this case, we're talking about diameter. So right there, picking something like apical doesn't really make sense, right? Because that's going vertically. So when we're talking about growth in diameter, then it makes perfect sense that you would be, even if you didn't know what meristem was, that you're talking about lateral growth. All right. I'm gonna read this. A lot of you that need to answer, so get your answers in. Okay, ready? Oh, there's more people coming in now. There we go. I think we're 85 today. Oh, there we were 86. So, majority of you, well, yeah, 57% of you did get this right. So, in terms of our second most popular answer here, which is A, when stems bend toward the light as they grow, the leaves will shade the stem and keep it from getting too hot. That answer doesn't make a ton of sense to me. So if you picked that one and you can make that make sense, I encourage you maybe after class to tell me how. Because we're thinking about an advantage, right? So A doesn't really apply in a whole lot of situations in terms of keeping it from getting too hot. What's too hot? The better answer here is B. So when roots grow away from the light, they'll grow deeper into the soil. That's an advantage, because then they're able to get water and nutrients. So that's what you want. You want root growth. So auxin is a signal that elicits two different responses on different parts of the plant that then select for the plant's survival. So that is why that B is the correct answer here. Let's do this one. About 10 more seconds. All right. Yep, it is D. During meiosis when spores are formed. If you don't recall that from class the other day, please make sure you make a note of this. Dr. Brewer went over this in really great detail. And so when something that we repeat over and over tells you it's pretty important. Switch gears a little bit. Let's go here. There's 2 more people, but I'll show you the answer. Yes, it's B. No oxygen gas in the atmosphere. So you may be wondering at this point, what? I thought I was allowed to forget that. That was in a previous unit. We don't want you to forget any of it, because it's all important. So there are things that we're talking about. We're talking about increasing diversity of different species. It's really important that as you take this class that there are things that you remember throughout the theme of the class. This is one of them. Okay, so understanding how the atmosphere of the Earth changed over time and how that impacted evolution. So that is why I put that question in there. So speaking of which, get your votes in. All right. Nice job, mitochondria. Hey, you guys are on it today. I'm very happy with this so far. All right. So I'm not going to do the diversity ones now. Do you want me to do a few more plant ones or? things that stick out. And again, this says you are most likely, but for me, I think about something being small and close to the ground, as well as lacking veins. So in this case, you were looking at a moth, most likely. Okay? So if you don't remember, plant diversity is part of this quiz as well. So I know we already did plants previously, but there's still some plants that are going to be on this quiz, so don't forget them. Let's go here, because I know you talked about this one.
Two of those you should just be able to eliminate immediately.
Do you want them to discuss, or do you want us to make another
Sure, I
motion?
can discuss it.
All right, so take a little bit of time, maybe 30 seconds, and see if you can make a good case to your neighbor.
Our wetlands that they acidify the water around them.
They have like
Yeah.
and then I remember seeing like peat bog is what acidifies the environment.
I don't even know what.
Yeah, I'm not even sure what it is. But I just remember that acidify the environment that it limits the decomposition. That's what peat bog is.
That's why I don't want to use it.
The rest of that, I don't know. It's decomposing. Because they're not decomposing. Mosses.
Yeah. That's only for fungi. And then heterotrophs. Because aren't mosses plants?
Yeah, they're small.
So they just get the autotrophs from sunlight, like plants.
Yeah.
Because mosses are land plants too.
Like, do mosses have the root system and everything? Or is it like,
No, they're
yeah, they're like biophytes or something like that, where they grow on surfaces?
yeah, with no vascular system.
Yeah.
So they are still plants, so they can't be heterotrophs. I don't know what the hell that is.
These carbon
Yeah, that's what I was
could be.
because I thought Hippox is the one that acidifies.
Yeah, that does the acidifying. But then this could be the one that releases. Like they work together. Acidify their
I thought Hippox.
yeah, I think it's
Yeah, I'm switching up.
yeah.
All right, closing the voting, so get them in. We gotta finish up animal diversity, so a little bit split here. So make a note to yourself that if you don't know that D is the correct answer here, then you need to go back over and review this as you study. Okay, I'm gonna kick it over to Dr. Brewer, and then if we have more time for questions in a little bit, then.
Review before that. Maybe you didn't know that they acidify their environment. You should have at least been able to eliminate A and C pretty quickly. Right? So A, are they decomposers? What kind of plants are decomposers? None. Are they heterotrophs? No, they are autotrophs. So plants are autotrophs. So you should have immediately been able to eliminate A and C. That took a little conversation, it looks like. So maybe you were confused about whether B or D is right. Well, that's fine, but at least you should have been going at A and C. All right. Let's do a little bit of talking about animal diversity again. So you guys have done some reading on your own, maybe you've done some launchpad activities, that's fine. So what we want to look at here is what are the critical takeaway points about animal diversity in this chapter? Because there's a huge amount of information. So what I want you to look at to begin with is have some understanding of this phylogenetic tree of the animals. All right, the simplest of animals are things that are a lot like choanoflagellates, but are just clumped together, sponges. And then we start to see some level of tissue differentiation. Among the ctenophores and the cnidarians, there are two different tissue layers. So what a tissue is a group of specialized cells that works together towards a common function. So this is something that is highly characteristic of complex multicellularity. Now, the bilaterians have three different tissue layers. And they are characterized by having this gastrulation process, a developmental process that leads to a tunneling through from that ball of cells that's initially formed as an embryo. Now, the bilaterians are broken down further into two different groups, two major groups, the protostomes and the deuterostomes. The protostomes are further broken down into two major groups, ecdysozoans and lophotrochozoans. The thing to do to help make sense of this is to think the lophotrochozoans are mostly soft-bodied, kind of worm-like creatures and some mollusks, whereas the ecdysozoans are organisms that have to molt. They have an outer coating that has to be removed in order to grow. So among the lophotrochozoans, we're really just going to focus on a couple of groups to know something about, because they represent some major evolutionary advances. So the simplest body plan of animals would just be a bunch of cells in a kind of a layer that allows for quick extraction of materials from its environment. This is kind of what we see with some of these worm-like lophotrochozoans. But then we see the annelid worms, we see a new development. The development of segmentation in the body plan. Instead of just having one big mass of cells, we see segments of the body plan. And this is something that we will see again. Even in our body, we have segmentation in our body plan. Think of your vertebrae and your ribs. These are different repeating segments. So this is a way to get a complex body plan by repeating and modifying structures. So we will see that trait again and again. With the annelid worms, we start to see some really more complex tissue development into organs and organ systems. So the annelid worms are segmented worms that have a complete digestive tract. So that means they've got a mouth on one end and an anus on the other end. Food goes in one end, comes out another end. That's not something that was characteristic of the cnidarians, for instance. And then we start to see the elements of a nervous system, the beginning of something that can control movement with things like sponges and many of the cnidarians. A complex nervous system isn't really necessary because they're either fixed in place and just catching whatever floats by, or they're drifting in the water. But with the ability to move and to look for food, you need more complex integration of information. So that's where we start to see the beginnings of a central nervous system, a central control point. So that's one of the other things that we're seeing among the annelids. Now, this other major group of organisms among the lophotrochozoans is very different from a lot of other forms of life, the mollusks. So the mollusks are characterized by a few traits. One of them is the mantle. This is a structure that can produce a shell. So many of the mollusks are soft-bodied for the most part, but they may have some kind of a shell. You're familiar with some of these. So gastropods. The name tells you something about it. Gastro. Whenever you see gastro, what should you be thinking about? That's stomach. Pod. What does a podiatrist do? Feet. Yes, they get aroused by feet. So gastropod, stomach, foot. But what does that really mean? Well, their stomach is kind of right on top of their foot. So here we got a foot, we got a stomach here. Not all the gastropods really have the stomach right on top of the foot, but they have the name of something. So the gastropods many of them are aquatic, but some of them live on land. Now, one of the characteristics of the gastropod is how they feed. So most of these are grazing animals. So they move along and then they will eat algae a lot of the time. So what kind of a body plan do you need for this? Well, you might need the ability to move. Because if you just eat whatever is growing near you, you're going to run out of food. So these animals have to be able to move. One of the things that's on the study guide is to look at body plans versus lifestyle. Understand how they feed, what do they feed on, and what does this mean in terms of their body plan. So filter feeding organisms, things like sponges, and some of the other mollusks that we look at, like bivalves. Filter feeding organisms don't need to have a complex nervous system. They don't really need to have a head region. They don't need eyes. They don't need sensory organs really at all. Because what they're doing is mostly sitting in one place and passing water through their bodies and then catching food. So sponges do this by being stuck in one place. Many mollusks do the same thing. They're stuck in one place and then they just pass water through their bodies. Now they have more complex feeding structures. So they have these gills that are adapted not necessarily for extracting oxygen, but for extracting food from their environment. So they have a siphon that pulls water in, passes it across these gills, and food particles can get stuck there and then will be digested. So there are other mollusks that have a very different lifestyle. So these mollusks are hunters, they're predators. One of the things that I want you to see in terms of trends in body plan is that as we look at animals that are filter feeders, we see less symmetry of body plan. So many times there's no symmetry or there's radial symmetry. There's often a limited ability to move. With filter feeders, the water is bringing food to you. With herbivores, we often see some kind of a central nervous system and a head region with sensory organs, because these animals have to be able to move, but many times they're not moving really fast. Whereas animals that are predators tend to be fast moving, and they have more complex nervous systems and more complex sensory systems. That's because the food that they're going to try and eat can often get away from them, can move. So they have to be able to move and integrate information faster. So among the cephalopods, what does cephalo refer to? Head, or sometimes even brain. So these are some of the smarter animals. They have the head, foot. Well, they will have feeding structures for capturing and then oftentimes biting off chunks of their prey. And they have much more complex nervous systems. So they have really well-developed eyes. Some of the octopods and the other types of cephalopods, like squids, will have really complex eyes and brains that can allow them to solve problems. These octopuses can do some really amazing things. Look for some of the videos on the YouTubers. All right, another major group of the protostomes. This is different from the Lopotropozoans. Notice what I did there with the Lopotropozoans. What did I do? Did I go through all of these groups? No. I focused on just a couple. The annelid worms, what do you need to know about them? Segmentation of the body plan, complete digestive tract, and then I talked about the mollusks. Know a little bit about the diversity of the mollusks. All right, now we're skipping on to the ecdysozoans. Yeah?
So
Is there a bilaterian? I'm not understanding all of the words. Bilateral, the bilaterians. That just means they have generally bilateral symmetry. Okay? And so they do have usually 3 different tissue layers. So that goes along with it. So one of the big characteristics of the bilaterians is that there's going to be a defined head region. Bilateral usually correlates with moving and finding food. So there's different types of symmetry that we were looking at. Asymmetry, no symmetry at all, often means you're stuck in one place and you're just trapping whatever food comes by. Radial symmetry often means the same thing. So with both asymmetry and radial symmetry, there's usually very limited sensory systems. If there is any kind of sensory system at all, it's usually distributed, meaning that all parts of the body have some limited ability to detect their environment. But with bilateral organisms, you're usually seeing a head region, and that head region has multiple sensory organs, and that requires a more complex nervous system. All right, so among the protostomes, the other big group, the ecdysozoans, we need to understand the big defining characteristic of the ecdysozoans, and that is that they molt. Why do they molt? Because they have some kind of an exoskeleton, and that exoskeleton limits growth. So when the animal has to grow, it has to shed its outer coating and then grow a new one. Now that outer coating could be something very simple, like nematodes. Nematodes are roundworms. So these are worms. We don't typically think of worms as having a shell. So these nematodes, their outer coating is really just a thin layer of protein, but it is something that has to be molted in order for them to continue to grow. The big group of ecdysozoans that we would pay the most attention to, though, is the arthropods. And among the arthropods, we have a diverse group, some that are aquatic and some that are on land. The aquatic arthropods are generally the crustaceans, things like crabs, lobsters, shrimp. The land arthropods include some of the biggest groups of animals, the insects, but also some related groups like chelicerates, spiders, centipedes, things like that. So the big defining characteristic of the arthropods is in their name. Arthro, arthritis. What is arthritis? It's joint swelling or inflammation, joint pain. Arthro is jointed. Pod, foot. So arthropods have jointed legs. What that means is that their legs can bend. This is important because there are some of the animals that we kind of ignore, kind of bristled worms, that have these things that are kind of like legs, but they're just really sticking straight out. They don't have much flexibility. The jointed leg allows for a diversity of extensions of the body plan. So they have many different types of potential arms and legs and swimmerettes, and they're jointed for flexibility. So think of something like medieval knights with their suits of armor. This is for protection, right? You've got this metal all around you. But if you're completely encased in metal, you're not very mobile. So those suits of armor would usually have jointed regions for some flexibility. So the arthropods have more jointed flexibility. When we look at some of these other ecdysozoans, many of them don't have much flexibility. So the nematodes are kind of worm-like, but if we added more and more of a shell on them, they'd be less and less flexible. These jointed legs allow for flexibility, and it also is modified in many different ways. So the segmentation that we first see in annelids is really taken to another level among the arthropods. So what this figure is showing you is just a variety of different segments of the body plan that can be repeated and then modified. So there will be a head region, and then there will be an abdominal region and a thorax region in many of these arthropods, 3 different major regions of the body. And what will often happen is there will be subsegments that get multiplied and then modified. So the head region of some arthropods may just consist of some kind of mandibles, some kind of jaw-like structure, and some antennae. And then some of the arthropods have multiple jointed things that have been modified into really complicated mouth parts. And then the next region may have a few pairs of legs, or it could have dozens of pairs of legs that have been modified for different things. So that's what we're seeing here. Among the crustaceans, their head region can have many different segments with multiple antennae, multiple modified mouth parts. Instead of just having 3 pairs of walking legs, they have 5 or 6 pairs of walking legs. So we see among the different groups of the arthropods, they vary in terms of how many different segments they use for each of these parts of their bodies, and then what they do with them. So the major groups of arthropods, I want you to know a little bit about them. So, crustaceans. These are the aquatic arthropods. They have an exoskeleton that's usually chitin that's been modified with something else. It may have some calcium carbonate added into it. So chitin is something we've seen before. We saw this among the fungi. Fungi are in the same superkingdom as animals. So we can make one of these molecules that is common to fungi as well. This is not something that you would see in plants or other protists. So the crustaceans live in the water. So their exoskeleton provides them protection. And in order to absorb material from their environment, especially oxygen, they have to have some specialized breathing structures. Because a hard outer shell is good for protection, but it's not good for absorption. It blocks absorption. So they're in water that would have oxygen dissolved in it, but the shell will prevent it. So usually they have some kind of gill structure to breathe. The crustaceans include things like lobsters, crabs, and all of that. They are closely related to the insects. Insects are the most abundant animal on this planet, right? So the insects are characterized by having 3 pairs of walking legs, and usually also wings. But many of the insects have lost wings during their development. Now, there are related groups, the myriapods and chelicerates. The chelicerates include spiders. So what defines them is their complex mouth parts. They can have variations in the numbers of walking legs. So spiders have 4 pairs of legs, but there are others like mites that have 5 pairs of walking legs. But what characterizes them is their complex mouth parts. The myriapods include centipedes and millipedes, and they have multiple pairs of walking legs. It's not always well defined. Now, centipedes, centa means what? 100. They don't have 100 legs. Myriapods can include also millipedes. Milli is 1,000. They don't have 1,000 legs. The difference between centipedes and millipedes is in how many pairs of walking legs they have per segment. Centipedes, in each segment of their body, they have 1 pair of walking legs on either side. Millipedes have 2 pairs per segment. So you see them crawling around. Is this a centipede or a millipede? Centipede, 1 pair of walking legs per segment. All right. Now, the insects are the most abundant group of animals on this planet, and they have modified their molting to another degree. Many of the arthropods have a stage of life where they undergo a real transformation, a complete change. So metamorphosis, this is a change in the shape. So many of the insects undergo a complete metamorphosis, where they have one stage of their body plan that's optimized for feeding. So like the caterpillar. Caterpillars just crawl around and eat and eat and eat. And then they have another stage that's really there for reproduction and dispersal, the flying stage. Many times, the insects that undergo this complete metamorphosis, their flying stage may be incapable of eating. So there are some moths and some flies that in their flying stage, they don't have working mouth parts. They live for maybe a day or so. And in that day or so, they need to quickly find a mate, fertilize, lay eggs, and then they're going to starve to death. So they have built up energy in the feeding stage to undergo this big change, to go through the stage where they can go through the mating and dispersal. And this allows for separation of 2 distinct phases of their body. So, among the protostomes, you don't have to know that many groups, all right? I've focused on just a few of those groups, and I want you to know some of their characteristics. The deuterostomes are important because this is the group that includes us. What's the difference between protostome and deuterostome? Which hole becomes the mouth? Is it the first hole or the second hole? Deutero means the second hole is the mouth. So when the blastopore starts forming in gastrulation, the first hole is the anus among the uterus ducts. All right, so there is a bunch of different groupings here, some of which we're going to kind of ignore. We'll briefly look at the echinoderms, and then we're going to look at the chordates. So the echinoderms, you may have read and answered some questions in Launchpad about the echinoderms. I want you to know their basic characteristics. They're kind of strange. So they have a body plan that's really unique. They have what's called pentaradial symmetry. Now, with some of these organisms, if you look at like a sea urchin, from above, it looks kind of like a circle, and that implies radial symmetry. But they have a different version of radial symmetry. It's pentaradial. It's easier to see in these sea stars. Pentaradial means that the body plan radiates out from a central point, but there are 5 distinct regions to the body plan. It's easy to see in these sea stars, there's 5 regions. Not as easy to see in some of the other echinoderms, like sea urchins or sand dollars. But if you turn them upside down, and sometimes you might have to cut away a part of their body, if you look on the inside, they radiate out in 5 different directions. Another big characteristic of the echinoderms is part of their name. Echinoderm. What does derm mean? Skin. Echino refers to spiny. So they have spiny skins. They have an exoskeleton. But they also have some other unique traits, like the water vascular system. So the way they move around is not by use of muscles attached to their skeleton. Instead, they have a water vascular system, which is really like a system of flexible tubes that can suck water in and then pump it to different regions of the body. And so by extending these water tubes, they can creep around relatively slowly. Most of the echinoderms are grazers, but some of them are kind of hunters. Some sea stars will eat mollusks by grabbing onto them and tunneling through their shells and then sucking the meat. Then we get to the chordates. So the chordates includes us. There are a few defining characteristics of the chordates. So the chordates, the name implies, have a cord. The cord runs the length of the body. It's the beginning of what will become a central nervous system. So the chordates have a long neural tube running down the length of their body. Now, in vertebrates like ourselves, one end of this neural tube is going to become the brain. But in the simplest of the chordates, you don't really see a defined brain region. Other characteristics that are common to all chordates are pharyngeal gill slits. We are chordates. That means we have pharyngeal gill slits. Where are your pharyngeal gill slits? You don't have them anymore, but at one time you did. When you were an embryo, you went through a little fishy stage where you had pharyngeal gill slits. In the earliest of the chordates, these were involved in filter feeding. So these were aquatic animals that passed water through their pharyngeal gill slits and trapped food. They were then adapted for breathing. So some of the aquatic animals still have gills that they use for trapping oxygen from the water. These animals all have a complete digestive tract, mouth to anus, that's the length of the body, and in addition to the neural tube that will give rise to the spinal cord, it will have some kind of protection over it. Now in the simplest of the chordates, this notochord is going to be made mainly of cartilage, so a flexible material like the stuff that's in your ears. But in the vertebrates, which is a subsection of the chordates, this will be reinforced with bone. I'm going to skip the tunicates. Let's not ask any questions about tunicates. It's too complicated. All right, so the vertebrates are a subgrouping of the chordates, and they have certain characteristics. One characteristic is they have a defined head region with a cranium, some kind of protection over the brain. The pharyngeal gill slits are going to be present at some stage in the body, and there will be a very complex nervous system. Now, among the vertebrates, this is the phylogenetic tree. And there are certain traits that I want you to be aware of. You don't have to memorize this tree because if we ask you some questions about it, we're probably going to give you this phylogenetic tree. But I want you to see what's happening here in the evolutionary trends in the development of vertebrates. the ancestor of all vertebrates had some kind of a cranium and some kind of vertebrae. So that means that the notochord, that flexible cartilage cord that protected the central nervous system, grew an extension that protected the head region, that adapted into a brain, and then vertebrae that reinforced the notochord with some kind of bone. Now, not all of them have vertebrae that are made of bones. So some of these have actually lost their vertebrae, the hagfish, which are part of the group of cyclostomes, the jawless fish. They have circular mouths. Hagfish and lampreys lack a characteristic that we will see in all of the other vertebrates, which you find right here. This synapomorphy is the jaw. The jaw is derived from the pharyngeal gill slits. Many fish have gills that are protected by a structure called an operculum. So if you reinforce the gills, make them a little bit less flexible but a little bit more bony, then you can create a structure called a jaw, which can be used for biting and for chewing. This is a big evolutionary development because these earliest vertebrates, the hagfish and lampreys, all they can do is grasp onto something and kind of scrape a little bit of food off or suck some blood out. But if you have a jaw, you can take big chunks of food in for digestion. So the jaw was so useful and so important that it was kept in all of these other vertebrates. Then we see other evolutionary trends. Now from this point, there are some animals with a jaw that lack real bones. They are the cartilaginous fishes, sharks and the rays. And then there are the bony fishes. Among the bony fishes, and most of the fish on this planet, there are some that have little fins they can just use to swim that are kind of thin and ray-like. But then there are some that have thickened fins. We call these the lobe-fin fishes. And these are the fish that are close to the ancestors of the tetrapods, the animals that gave rise to eventually us. So the evolutionary trends that we're following here are the development of the jaw, lobed fins that will eventually become arms and legs, and the development of lungs. To this point in the phylogenetic tree, all of these animals are aquatic. The first animals on this planet lived in the water. And for most of the history of the animals on the planet, they stayed in the water. Animals were not able to really colonize the land until the simplest of plants started to colonize the land. But most of these vertebrates weren't there. The first animals to colonize the land were some of the ecdysozoans, things like insects. So it took a while before the vertebrates were able to get onto the land. And in order to get onto the land, they had to modify some of these traits. The lobed fins had to be thicker to support holding up the massive weight of the animal on land. Then they had to modify their breathing structures. In water, you can pass water across gills or even across a thin layer of skin and absorb oxygen. This doesn't work on land because in order to absorb gas through skin or through gills, you have to have a moist surface. On land, water tends to dry out. Your skin will dry out. If you have gills, they'll stick together and they won't work anymore. So the lung was an adaptation that allowed for life on land. There are some fish that live in the water that have lungs. We call them lungfish. So what they do is they can live in waters where there's not necessarily as much oxygen available. Sometimes in stagnant water, there's not a lot of gas exchange. The oxygen levels will be depleted. So some fish can go to the surface and gulp in air. Lungfish are really good at that. So the developments that we see here to life on land are improving those lungs and then changing the lobed fins to become more walking legs. So this is where we see the transition to the tetrapods. Now we have some fossil evidence of this transition. This transition happened over 300 million years ago. There were fish that are a lot like the lobed fin fishes, and then we see tetrapods that include something more like true amphibians. The important finding was this Tiktaalik fossil, which is a transition between the two. Something that's kind of like a fish, kind of like an amphibian. Reconstruction based on the skeleton. So the amphibians are animals that are kind of in transition between life on land and life in water. Just like with plants, one of the big problems that has to be overcome in moving from the water to the land is how do you reproduce? Animals that live in the water, just like plants or algae that live in the water, could send their sperm and their eggs outside of their bodies into the water for fertilization. But on land, that doesn't work very well. We saw the adaptations for plants, what they had to do to overcome this limitation to be able to reproduce on land. Well, amphibians are kind of a transition state. They can live on land, but they still need water for fertilization. So they're kind of like the bryophytes of animals. They're living on land, but they still require some water for fertilization. They go through different stages of their life to accomplish this. So they deposit their eggs in the water, they go through a transition state in the water, something like the tadpole, the larval stage, and then they move to the land. But when it's time to reproduce, they go back to the water. So the big evolutionary development that is more like what happened with the gymnosperms and the angiosperms, really separating reproduction from the need for water, was the development of the amniotic egg. So here, the amniote egg appears. The amniote egg is present in the ancestor of all the reptiles, eventually the ancestor of all the mammals. What the amniote egg does is it allows for the development of the embryo inside of a protected structure that can prevent drying out. So fertilization has to take place first. The amniote egg can allow for the embryo to develop, but you still have to get the sperm and the egg together. So among these organisms, we also see the development of internal fertilization. This is where you have a structure that goes inside of the other structure. I don't want to disturb you with body parts, but there is some sort of penis, some sort of vagina. The two have to come together to prevent the sperm from drying out, to have access to the egg. Sorry, I disturbed you a bit there. So if you're living in water, you could just lay eggs and then eject sperm, and the two can come together. On land, that doesn't work so well. So the earliest animals that developed internal fertilization still laid eggs. But if they lay eggs on land, the eggs are going to dry out because the eggs of the aquatic animals are just gel-like. So the amniotic egg is an advantageous development that allows for the development of the embryo outside of the parent body without drying out. Now, the amniotic egg is still a feature that's ancestral to the mammals, but we don't lay eggs outside of our bodies. So the amniotic egg is still considered a synapomorphy that was passed on to the mammals, but we adapted it so that the development is now internal. So among the mammals, there are certain traits that are synapomorphies that don't always appear to be there. So the two characteristics that define mammals are the presence of body hair and mammary glands. So all the mammals have some kind of mammary glands to produce milk to nourish their young. It's unique to the mammals. Now, all mammals have body hair. Now some of them have lost most of their body hair. As we see down here, whales and dolphins, they are not covered with fur. But if you look really closely at certain parts of their body, you might find the evidence of some whiskers here and there. Now, these animals have all acquired the same traits that were present early on in the phylogenetic tree. In some cases, you might see at various lineage points, some of the traits will be lost. So for instance, we go back here, walking legs. All mammals, all reptiles are tetrapods, so they should have 4 walking legs. But what about snakes? Snakes don't have any walking legs. What's happened? Are they really in the right group? Do they belong somewhere else? Well, the synapomorphy is there, but they lost those legs evolutionarily because the lifestyle that they lead. Many of them are burrowing through, sliding through things. And so they still have the remnants of the bones for the walking legs. They still have little tiny hip bones, but they don't have the legs. So among the mammals, the body hair is a synapomorphy of all mammals. Some of them have minimized it. By going back into the water, body hair is not necessarily so useful for all of Alright, and then the last part of this chapter is really relating back to some of the things that Dr. Dusser was talking about before. The evolution of animals on this planet, complex multicellular animals, depended on changes to the environment of the planet. You could not have complex animals until oxygen levels were high enough to support aerobic respiration in active, large-bodied creatures. So the earliest animal fossils are pretty simple. And they're things that if you looked at a fossil, you would not think that's an animal. Many of them have some sort of radial symmetry to them. So many of them were probably something like filter feeders. But then about 500 million years ago, a little bit more than 500 million years ago, we see fossil evidence of an explosion of diversity in body plans of animals. So this is where a lot of the bilaterians appeared and diversified. Many of the forms that we see fossil evidence of, they're no longer around. There's no evidence of any lineages that survive. There's some weird body plans among animals that previously existed that are no longer here. The echinoderms seem weird as a body plan for animals. Pentaradial symmetry. Well, there are some animals that will have 5 eyes. 5 eyes. Where does 5 eyes come from? There are some animals that have weird mouth parts on their head, but then they move backwards to the water. They apparently did. They don't do it anymore today. But this Cambrian fossil is just the evidence that we have of the explosion of animal diversity. And the big thing that triggered this possibility was the rise in oxygen levels. And what triggered that? That was the increase in diversity of the protists that led to the algae that started pumping larger and larger amounts of oxygen in the atmosphere. And then eventually, move on to land, or the land plants allowed for the movement of the animals onto the land. All of these things are related. What this last part is talking about is major events that have happened in the distant past. There have been times when there's been a big spike in diversity, followed by a drop. Every time the environment changes in some way, it's challenged. And sometimes that challenge results in wiping out of large parts of life. The early environment of this planet didn't have molecular oxygen. Photosynthesis seems like a great idea. Photosynthesis allowed some organisms to capture light energy and make sugars. But what it did was to add oxygen to the atmosphere. We think of this as a good thing, but for the bacteria that lived at that time, it was a terrible thing. It wiped out most of the bacteria on the planet. There have been other major changes over the last few hundred million years that have done the same kinds of things. Some major event changes the climate in some way. Sometimes it's related to biological events, sometimes it's abiological. But at various times in the past, there have been periods of mass extinctions followed by diversification. Mass extinction, diversification. That's all this is showing. All right, I think this is about enough. There's a little timeline here that shows you approximately when things moved onto land, when certain animal lineages appeared. One of the things I would like you guys to be aware of is the general timeline of life on this planet. When did photosynthesis first appear? What were the first organisms on this planet? When did animals appear? When did plants appear? When did plants move onto the land? When did animals move onto the land? So on. So take a look at that stuff. Let's do some more quick questions. Alright, so you were about right here. We have time? What do we got? We got like 8 minutes. We are having a quiz on Monday, right? Yeah, we're going to be ready for that. No. Monday, right?
Yeah, Monday.
Monday.
So we have just about 8 minutes left. There's one particular slide I wanted to show you guys. I loved a lot of the questions that you provided us last week. And so, I mean, some of you did a great job in terms of even like writing a full question, but I think we can refine some of the answer choices. And then others of you just kind of threw out an open-ended question, and that's okay. So I compiled this list of things that I liked and then bolded in particular ones that I thought were really, really good. I think the bulk flow is something that has come up in every unit. So don't be shocked if that one pops up again. There are several questions about yeast. So reproduction, a hyphae question in terms of whether the ancestors had hyphae. Did these ancestors have hyphae? That should have been a clicker question, huh? They did have hyphae, but these lost them. So that was actually in the chapter, and I think there's a phylogenetic tree that shows that as well. So please review that. So I saw a lot of you were taking pictures of this. If you need this, I can probably just upload this in a document, sort of more study guide questions essentially. There were things that we talked about, lichens and why they're useful bioindicators. And then there were a lot of questions on the mycorrhizae. So please make sure that you know those. We talked about those quite a bit. Dr. Brewer did a really beautiful job of talking about the dikaryotic fungi, and in particular the reproduction and the life cycle of fungi. So much like you had a life cycle on your last quiz, might be worth it to go back over that life cycle for this upcoming quiz.
And the same is true for the plant life cycle. The fungal life cycle is somewhat analogous to plant life cycles. When you look at sporophyte and gametophyte among the plants, which one is haploid, which one is diploid? What do they produce? Do they produce gametes? Do they produce spores? Are the gametes or the spores haploid or diploid? If they are, then what is the process that generates haploid from diploid or diploid from haploid? There's a similar life cycle in the fungi, but there are some differences. So what you want to do to try and make sense of this is understand first the ploidy state of each of the structures. We're talking about hyphae and fungi. Are they haploid or diploid? Hyphae. Haploid or diploid? Haploid. So, fungi can grow their hyphae almost forever, as long as the conditions are favorable. But then if conditions change, they may go into sexual reproduction. How do fungi reproduce sexually? Do they make sperm and eggs? No. What do? They fuse, first they fuse hyphae. When they fuse their hyphae, this is not the same thing as fertilization exactly, because they don't immediately put their nuclei together. This is one of those things that distinguishes the fungi, right? So, the question is, how do you get from that to the spores? So for fungi, there's maybe a fruiting body state. There can be a temporary diploid state, and then from that diploid fruiting body, you're going to generate spores. Are the spores haploid or diploid? Haploid. What are those spores going to become later on?
Hyphae.
Hyphae. So they are single-cell haploid cells that are going to become multicellular haploid organisms. So if the fruiting body starts off at least at some point as a diploid, and you're producing haploid spores, what is the process that generates those spores called? Meiosis. Again, return back to 2107 information. If you're going from diploid to diploid, that's mitosis. If you're going from haploid to haploid, that's mitosis. If you're going from haploid to diploid, what is that process?
Fertilization.
Fertilization. Or in the fungi, plasmogamy and then karyogamy. And then if you're going from diploid to haploid, what's the process?
All right, I think we have time for one clicker question.
Let's get it in.
I like that one, but it's not a,
One of the animal.
I know, I wanted to do a, let's do this one. Alright, ready? I know, last one.